I will introduce Elena Dimitrova, who's going to, complexity is not complicated, or cellular automata for simulation of pattern formation in living organisms.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody for turning out. And I don't think I'll take the whole hour, so there is little time between you and the pizza and the other festivities that I'm looking forward to. Before I lower the screen, I wanted to show you how two students in anticipation of my talk wrote a smiley face fractal. That's very cheerful beginning of a talk, I think. Although, to be really honest, I wasn't going to spend too much time on fractals. I'm going to talk about dynamic self-replicating structure. So, sorry, but maybe somebody else will talk about fractals in the future. All right, so I'll try to convince you that complexity doesn't mean the same thing as complicated necessarily. And my examples will be mostly from biology, but there'll be some others. All right, well, when I was in high school, my biology teacher asked us the following question. Why are there animals with spotted coats and striped tails, but no animals with striped coats and spotted tails? Have you noticed that? I had never thought about this, but when you really start thinking about it, you can come up with a counterexample. And I just put here some examples. So this guy here, I have no idea who he is, but he has spotted body and striped tail, right? This one has spotted body, spotted tail. This one spotted, striped body, striped tail, and there's no tail here, but I believe it's striped there. So anything you think about is any animal has one combination and not the other. And that seems like a very trivial and simple question. Biology should have been able to answer this long time ago, and then she finally did, and the answer may not be, it's actually not that complicated. It has something to do with melanin being deposited in the body during embryonic development, and it has something to do with the fact that an embryo doesn't have the same body shape as a grown-up animal or even a newborn, so it changes quite a bit, okay? So, but it took a long time to figure that out. How does this happen? So there are questions like this all over the place. Some of them may be more useful than this one. And it's just so mind-boggling that if you look at patterns, you find them everywhere, and it's almost hopeless to ever be able to figure out all of them, answers to all of them. So where do we find patterns? And let me hint you on that they're pretty much everywhere when you look around in nature. So this one you may not have even noticed because it's so common. When you look at clouds, they tend to form patterns. The seeds on a sunflower and the petals as well. Shells are a very rich source of patterns that we often don't understand how they were formed. So here's one of my few fractal examples. You can think of a tree as loosely as a fractal. So if you zoom on a portion of part of the branches of the tree, it looks like another tree itself. So it kind of keeps self-replicating. The lungs, there's definitely a clear pattern there. And remember this guy, we'll get back to this one. So it's the coloring of the shell it's quite bizarre. Why exactly this way? What's the reason? How did it happen? And all of his relatives, they look just about the same. It's not the exact same image, but it's the same pattern, right? We all know. Okay. So there is so much complexity, and I'm only talking about patterns. I'm not even getting any deeper into how life functions and all that, but just about pattern formation, which you may say it's quite superficial. It's just so complicated. Somebody once suggested it's hopeless to even look into it and try to understand it. But there is hope, I guess, because if you look at patterns formed by very simple living organisms, for example, this is, I think these are carpenter bees. I'm sorry, I don't quite know ants, not bees. I think I took an image of carpenter ants, and they tend to build their homes higher up. And it's a very complex structure. You've all seen on the ground or on a tree a structure built by wasps, bees, or ants. And you know it's not trivial at all. And somehow they manage to build it time and time again. Every time is a little different, but the pattern is the same, and it works. And we understand something about their nervous system. We know it's not that complicated. So they couldn't have some complicated, elaborate blueprints in their heads that they follow every time, and they communicate on walkie-talkies, and somehow they do the job. So that's not what's happening, right? It's got to be a simple explanation that they're able to replicate similar structure every time they build a home. So here this same guy again. And I couldn't find a better picture, but what I was trying to show you, it's an even simpler organism. So the example I had in mind, I've seen it with my eyes in the lab, but I couldn't find good images. Two species of bacteria, the prokaryotes, even simpler than ants. So if you put them in a petri dish with nutrients in it, and you put, maybe let's say you somehow color them to be red and green, put some green here, put some red here, and maybe a few more times, and then you let go, and after a while they form a very clear pattern in the petri dish. Right? It's not the same every time, but they somehow segment the petri dish in a very particular way. They say, I stay here, you stay there, you don't like to mix too much, maybe the boundaries are a little bit mixed, and they form this pattern again. So certainly they don't have a very good way of communicating with each other, and they're fairly simple. So if they can do it, we should be able to understand what's going on. So that gives us some hope that maybe we can get an idea of how this happens. So maybe complexity could emerge from very simple basic rules. And that's the whole idea. I just summarized my talk. You can go on. No. Let's keep going a little bit. So of course this idea has been around for a while, but it was the cellular automata that became a very popular tool to demonstrate it, play with it, and actually have some interesting real applications. And let me give you a little bit of history on the invention of cellular automata. There was some preliminary work done by Alan Turing. You may have heard of the Turing machine. Okay. So based on his work in the early 50s, John Neumann and Stanislaw Ulam at the Los Alamos National Lab, they first somewhat independently started working on that concept, and then they joined efforts, and they gave rise to some really active research in the 50s and 60s that continued, was pretty active up until the 80s. And there are three major events that marked the development of cellular automata. First, the John von Neumann's self-reproducing automaton that we're going to talk about. And then the fun part, John Conway's game of life that we are going to play together. And then Stephen Wolfram, who the creator of Mathematica. It's hard to not have heard about him. And he classified cellular automata and probably initiated the more detailed, serious research of cellular automata and many others. And I think this is Neumann, this is Conway. No, I think this is Conway, right? I have more pictures of him. He has lots of beautiful pictures. And that's gonna be Stanislaw Ulam. That's the only picture I could ever find. All right, so how did it work? How did it happen exactly that they joined efforts to work on that? Well, already in the 40s, Ulam studied the growth of crystals using a simple lattice network as his model, so he was already interested in self-replicating structures. And von Neumann had a very exciting project, which I don't think it went too far itself. His idea was to build a robot that can build a robot itself. And it was fairly challenging. I don't think he ever finished it, but along the way he came up with the idea of a very simple model. It was a discrete system that the self-replication. And then they started working together on that. So I felt obligated to give you the definition of cellular automata. You can find it on Wikipedia and many other places. I think the formal definition is actually better, but let's go through it. So this is a system made up of many discrete cells, so motion cells, arranged somehow, each of which may be in one of finite number of states, so everything is very finite there. And a cell, also called automata, may change state only at fixed regular intervals. Usually synchronous update is the popular thing to do. And only in accordance with fixed rules that only depend on the cell's own current state and the neighbors. So the key is the cell communicates only with itself and its neighbors. Very much like we would imagine maybe ants do, who knows. The neighbors, you define them within certain proximity, whatever works for your particular case. So you can say that the cellular automata is, usually we talk about 1 or 2 dimensional grids. There is no reason not to talk about higher dimensions, but these are highly visual tools, so it gets harder in 3 or higher dimensions. So each cell possesses information and proceeds in its action depending on the neighbors. So a cell is defined by its possible states. Our examples would be 2 states only. There is a set of transition rules that tell you how a cell, under what circumstances a cell can transition from one state to another. And we'll think about mostly the synchronous case when those transition rules give you the transition from one state to the next of the cell, and that happens at steps, the same step for all the cells. So let's get to the examples. So first we're going to look at the simplest example, a one-dimensional cellular automata of length n. So you have an array of as many cells as you want. And often, usually, we think of them as wrapping around. So you have a circular graph really, so that everybody has a neighbor. Otherwise, these 2 end cells will be neighborless, right? And and there is, you apply the same function to every cell, again, to make it really simple. So here is, again, same information, but with an example. So I didn't draw them as circles, takes too much space, so think about this end glued to the other end, right? So, so it's a ring, a finite number of squares or cells, and each one, in this case, only has 2 neighbors, right? In 1 dimension, square to the left, square to the right, and each square can be, it's up to you whether you have only 2, 3, or more colors. What's mostly studies is 2 colors. We're going to use black and white. And in the next step, each color depends, in the cell depends on the color, its own color, and its neighbor's colors. So for example, let's start with this initialization. Okay? And again, remember, these 2 are touching the other cells. And suppose that we want to apply the majority rule. So every neighborhood consists of 3 cells, so it's an odd number, you can have a majority rule. And let's say this guy here is black, 2 white neighbors, so the majority rule gives white. So at the next step, its color is going to be white. Right? Let's look at the end ones that are glued together. So this one is black and has 2 white neighbors, again white at the next step. Okay? So that's one example. Of course, you can have many other rules. We don't have names such as majority rule for every for every rule you may want to define. Let me just give you another example. So suppose these are the rules. So oftentimes the rules are defined pictorially this way. Okay? So these are all possible configurations of 3 cells, right? Colorings of 3 cells with 2 colors. And it tells you, so current state, future state, current state, next state, right? So again, let's say this one is white, it has a white neighbor, a white neighbor and a black neighbor, so we look it up, looks like it's this one, right? Okay, so in the next step, its color is white, so again, you apply the rules on the same cells. And what do you think happens next if you apply once again the same rules? I'm not changing the rules, just now I start from a different point. Do you see a pattern? Okay, I'll help you one more step. This is the next step. Do you see the pattern now? Oh, come on, probably ants can figure it out. It's very simple rules. I mean, there are like, how many? 4 of them. 8 of them, sorry. So it shouldn't be that hard. You should be able to be like, oh, I see what happens if I keep going, I see the pattern. Well, I don't, really, so I don't blame you if you don't either. But if you really keep going for a while, well, this is going a little bit for a while, so you're like, oh, I think there is a pattern, something is starting to become clearer, well, maybe. And then if you really keep going, that's what happens. So you're like, oh, okay. So, and that's very typical situation with cellular automata, even the simplest one, and you can't think of the simplest cellular automata than this one, that you get some complex patterns from very simple rules. So maybe you're not very impressed with this one, but I'll show you better ones. So a few facts before that about cellular automata. The one that I just showed you is the simplest non-trivial cellular automata, again one-dimensional, 2 possible states per cell. And so let's do some counting. So because we take a cell in 2 neighbors, so we have 3 cells in a neighborhood, so there are 2 to the third 8 possible patterns for a neighborhood, and there are 2 to the 8 or 256 possible rules. Right? So that's a pretty small number. And people often don't have much else to do, so it was inevitable that somebody's going to sit down and explore all of them and categorize them and spend who knows how much time on them. And Stephen Wolfram did that, and he enumerated all the rules from 0 to 255, so his code is the one that's adopted, so when you say 13, you mean a particular rule. And people studied them, and some interesting things emerged, especially, so not all of them are all that interesting, but especially rules 30 and 110 are interesting. One is actually more interesting than the other. So this is rule 110, it's an interesting pattern. But if you're not impressed, let me remind you of this little guy. So it turns out that the pattern on the shell of this Honos textile, I'm sure you've seen it on the beach, can be generated using rule number 30. So that would be, again, it's not always exact that, there is some shifting, but that is the pattern. So let's go through what's going on. So the pigment cells, how does it happen biologically? Of course, the cell doesn't run a cellular automaton somehow in its little brain, but so the pigment cells, as the shell, the way the shell grows, I'm being told is, so if you think of the lip of the shell, that's where it grows and it starts coiling, or maybe the other way around, coiling out, one way or another. So on the lip, there are pigment cells that are initialized somehow, and it's random really. The initialization probably comes from the parents, but you have some initialization. And each cell secretes pigment according to the activating or inhibiting activities of the neighboring cells. So you need proximity. So oftentimes unless you have enzyme concentration and stuff like that, oftentimes in biology you need physical proximity, especially on genetic levels. Genes that are situated close together on the genome, you may suspect they have some influence over each other. So depending on the activity, its own state and the activity of the neighboring cells, pigmentation is secreted or it's not secreted. And turns out that the rules that are followed are actually these rules. Instead of black and white, I use 0 and 1. So 1 is white, 0 is black. So, for example, black, black, black gives white, and so on. Okay? So you can think of this as a natural cellular automaton. And there's the picture once again. And I showed this to a class once, and they were like, well, the ends looked a little not so good. I remember seeing that chair where the ends were all messed up, and I don't know, my guess is that it's really not a circular graph. So if you have pigmentation here and here. Probably initially they were very close, but as it was growing, they were getting further apart. And since they can communicate over distance, maybe that's why they observe. But this one looks actually pretty good to me. I think the pattern is being followed pretty well. So let's talk a little bit about the, I already showed you this, about the dynamics. So again, Stephen Wolfram studied it further, and all these 256 rules, he categorized it into 4 classes. And so he said some are spatially stable, such as this one. I'm sorry you can't see, but it says class 1. So those that settle into a very stable pattern. Okay? Also, sequence of stable or periodic structure. So you have a mixture of the two, such as this one, class 2. And chaotic aperiodic behavior, such as this one, and root 30 was an example of one of those. And complicated localized structures, such as this one. You can get something like that. So it's the most popular classification. There are others, but this one is the most popular. The problem is that the membership problem is not very clear here, meaning that if I give you a rule, it's not always clear to which class it belongs. For example, clearly these two, there's got to be some overlap. When do we have chaotic aperiodic behavior, and when do you call a structure complicated? Like, I don't know about these two, where I would put them. So he has an opinion on that, but people argue that that's not necessarily the best classification. So that's what I wanted to say about one-dimensional cellular automata. Let's move to 2 dimensions. So 2 dimensions, really everything remains the same, except for that you have a 2-dimensional grid. You can have multiple colors. We'll stick to 2 colors again. And most of the time we assume, instead of trying to somehow wrap it around, we assume that it's just an infinite plane. Okay? And there are 2 ways to define a neighborhood. One is what von Neumann suggested, 4 neighbors. Another one is Moore's neighborhood with 8 neighbors. We'll mostly talk about, well, only talk about this way of defining neighborhoods. And the simplest case is when all squares are use the same rule to update their colors, and you can start with any initialization. So based on that, John Conway invented the so-called game of life, or just life, in 1970. It is a special instance, a special rule for 2-dimensional cellular automata, and it became incredibly popular. So he's credited for making cellular automata very popular, and also credited for killing the research on cellular automata, because they supposedly, some people say, they started being perceived as a recreational tool rather than a serious research area. But I'm not sure about it. That's what I've heard. I was once even told, if you ever do work on cellular automata, don't put it on your CV because they have bad reputation. I don't know. We'll see. I'll mention serious applications, so it's up to you. But it's a lot of fun, and there's some really serious implications, even though it's just a game. So what is the game about? So I'm going to describe the rules. So it's a special case of a cellular automata. And here are the rules. They're easy to remember because you can explain them to yourself. To say that, so every cell has 8 neighbors, Moore's neighborhood. And for a cell in a square, so if a cell, let's say it's already black, okay? So if it has 1 or no neighbors meaning white, so everything is white, it dies of loneliness. If it has 4 or more neighbors, it dies of overcrowding. If it has 2 or 3 neighbors, it survives. And those rules may vary depending on which version you run into, but these are the most popular. And if you start with an empty square, if the square has exactly 3 alike neighbors, the cell is born in this square. Okay? Very simple rules. Again, not hard to remember them, not hard to apply them. So let's see if we can predict the future of a given configuration.